Caroline Fairchild did not argue when her husband told her she could not accept the position. She thanked him, folded the letter from the Hartford Female Seminary, and spent the next 3 days deciding what to do with the rest of her life. If you want to know whether a woman like that ever came home, and whether the man who let her go deserved it when she did, stay until the end and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Connecticut River Valley, October 1852. The elms along the road into Wethersfield had turned to hard gold, and the river smell came in under every door, and Caroline Fairchild sat at the breakfast table of a very fine house and understood, for perhaps the 10th time in 7 years, that understanding a thing clearly is not the same as knowing what to do about it. She was 27 years old. She had been married at 20 to Sebastian Fairchild, who was then 33 and already prosperous and already certain, in the comfortable way of certain men, that he had correctly understood the shape of his life. He had not married her cruelly. That was the most important thing to know about Sebastian Fairchild, and in its way, the most difficult. He had come to her father's house in the spring of 1845, when her father's shipping concern was failing quietly, and the Webb family's standing in Wethersfield was becoming a question people were beginning to discuss. Sebastian had been introduced to Caroline and had asked her opinion on 3 things during that first visit: the Connecticut River trade, the state of the season's tobacco, and whether she thought the northern mill towns were improving or declining. She had answered all 3 honestly, and at some length. He had listened. She had not yet understood that listening was not the same as hearing. They had married 6 months later. He had been faithful and reliable, and consistently kind in the measured way of a man who equates the absence of harm with the presence of love. He had given her the house on 11 acres, the household accounts, and a position in Wethersfield society that her father's failures had nearly made impossible. He had believed, in the uncritical way that certain men believe things without examining them, that this constituted a life worth having. In the 2nd year of their marriage they had lost a child. They had not spoken of it, not then and not since, which was perhaps the first wrong turn, the one they could not find their way back from. The grief went somewhere private in each of them, and the distance between those 2 private places never entirely closed. Caroline had managed the distance the way she managed everything, by filling the space with work. She had, over 7 years, built a system for running the Fairchild estate that was thorough and largely invisible, the way the best systems always are. She managed the household and the correspondence with the mill agents and the quarterly accounts, and a tenant dispute on the southern boundary that had been festering since 1849. She had been corresponding under the name C. Webb with the Hartford Courant on the subject of women's property rights. She had been in quiet contact with Mrs. Halloway at the Hartford Female Seminary since the previous spring. The letter arrived on a Thursday. It was not an inquiry, it was an offer. A faculty position in natural philosophy and estate mathematics, a salary, a small apartment on the seminary grounds. Caroline waited 2 days before she showed it to Sebastian. He read it at the breakfast table on Saturday morning. He set it beside his coffee cup. He said, "I think that's very admirable, Caroline." She waited. "But of course, you can't accept it." She asked him why. He listed the household, the mill accounts, the management of the tenant correspondence, his mother's quarterly visits. He listed these things not as debts she owed him but as a life she had, as though the arrangement of his needs constituted her purpose by settled mutual understanding. He was not unkind about it. He was, in his way, genuinely puzzled that she was asking. She said, "What would you do, Sebastian, if I were not here to do those things?" He said he supposed he would manage. She thanked him. She folded the letter. She returned it to her drawer. On Tuesday morning she wrote her acceptance to Mrs. Halloway. She told Sebastian on Wednesday evening, after the supper dishes had been cleared and the candles were burning low. She told him the way she delivered all difficult truths, without drama, without apology, as a simple fact. She had accepted the position. She would leave Friday. Her trunk would go ahead Thursday. Sebastian set down his fork. He said her name. He said it the way he said everything. Measured, unhurried, with the quiet confidence of a man who has rarely needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. She said, "You told me on Saturday that of course I couldn't accept it. I want you to understand that there is no of course. There is only what I choose." He said, "Caroline, this is your home." She said, "This is a very comfortable house. My home is wherever I decide it is." The silence between them lasted long enough for the candles to burn a half-inch lower. She saw something working through his face. Not anger, not grief. The particular expression of a man who has encountered a situation he cannot map. She went upstairs, she finished packing. She moved through the room the way she moved through everything, with the focused economy of a woman who has learned that hesitation is something she cannot afford. In the morning, she was gone. The Fairchild estate did not fall apart without her. It listed. It tilted in the way of a clock that has lost one gear. Still running, slightly wrong, in ways that accumulated. Sebastian discovered this in increments across the first 2 weeks, and the discovery was in its own way more unsettling than the argument had been, because it was not dramatic. It was just precise. The first thing was the mill accounts. He had known, in a general way, that Caroline managed correspondence with the mill agents. What he had not known was that she managed them through a system she had built over 5 years. Individual workers, hours against recorded wages, a column of discrepancies she had been quietly catching and correcting for half a decade. Without her, 3 workers' October wages came out wrong. One of them came to the house on a Saturday, hat in hand, patient in the way of a man who understands the distance between what is just and what he can demand. Sebastian spent 2 hours with the ledger before he found it. The second thing was the tenant survey. There was a question about the Whittle family's land title on the eastern boundary. He remembered Caroline mentioning it in the spring. He had told her it didn't sound urgent. He had not considered that she had subsequently spent 4 months corresponding with a Hartford attorney named Mr. Coates about it, or that she had commissioned a boundary survey in August, or that Coates had written twice since her departure asking for instructions. He found these letters in her writing desk on the 9th day. He went in looking for the mill agent's file and found instead a record of a life he had not known was being lived inside his own house. Correspondence with the mill agents, letters to neighboring landowners, a file labeled Eastern Boundary with the survey and the Coates letters indexed and flagged. And in the bottom drawer, a small account book in Caroline's hand. Weathersfield Scholarship Fund, begun 1849. He opened it. 7 names. 7 girls from the mill and tenant families, whom Caroline had been sending to school, $1 at a time, from the savings she kept in a tin at the back of the wardrobe. He recognized 2 of the names. He had not known they were in school. He sat at her desk until Mrs. Hobart knocked to ask about supper. He did not turn around. Later, after supper, after the house had gone quiet, he found, in a separate folder, a bundle of newspaper clippings. Articles from the Hartford Courant on women's property rights, women's education, the legal standing of married women under Connecticut law. Several were annotated in Caroline's hand. 3 bore in the author line, the initials C. Webb. He sat with those for a long time. Wethersfield talked, the way small Connecticut towns always have. By the end of the first week, the story had gone from the dry goods counter to the milliner's to the church porch, gaining texture at each stop. The prevailing view among the men who gathered at the hardware store was that Caroline Fairchild had always been too educated for her own comfort. Josiah Brent said a woman who reads law books for amusement is a woman looking for reasons to be dissatisfied. Horace Dunning said Sebastian was better off letting her get it out of her system. Mrs. Lowe, who ran the fabric shop on Main Street and had known Caroline since she was 12 years old, reading her father's legal texts at the back of the Webb parlor, said without lowering her voice, Sebastian Fairchild is a good man who has not once in 7 years looked directly at the woman he married. He knew she was capable. He used her capability. He called it a household. She said it to the 2 women, choosing ribbon for winter bonnets, and they went home and thought about it. Crawford Stokes said nothing. Crawford Stokes was a man of particular ambitions who had been watching the eastern tract of Fairchild land for 3 years, and he was the kind of man who sees disorder in another household the way certain animals scent water. He began to make quiet inquiries about the Whittle family and 4 other tenants on the eastern boundary, about a county survey from 1831 that had not been properly re-registered after a courthouse fire. He hired an attorney in Hartford, a man named Aldgate, to begin filing. Sebastian wrote to Caroline on the 14th day. He did not apologize. He had not yet found the language for that. But he described what he had found: the mill accounts, the scholarship book, the Coates correspondence, the survey. He described sitting at her desk and understanding, for what he called the first time, the full weight of what she had been doing. In the second-to-last paragraph he wrote, I do not say this to ask you to come back. I say it because it is true and I should have known it long before now. You were not managing my household. You were building something I never troubled myself to see, and I called it the paperwork. The last paragraph said, "The books in your study are still arranged the way you left them. No one knows the system but you. Without you, it has simply stopped." Caroline read the letter at her desk at the seminary, in the small office that had her name on the door. She set it face down and went to teach her afternoon session on estate mathematics, because her hands needed something to do. She wrote back 3 days later. She said, "The books are arranged by feeling. What I need when I reach for them in the dark. Comfort on the left, curiosity on the center shelf, courage on the right. I suggest you leave them as they are." She said, "The Coates correspondence is in the file labeled Eastern Boundary. Write to him this week. The Whittle title is sound if the survey is properly presented." She said, "I am well, Sebastian. Better, in fact, than I have been in some years. I do not say that to wound you. I say it because I think you deserve to know what 7 years of invisibility costs a person, and what it looks like when the cost stops being paid." He read the letter twice. He set it on the desk beside the scholarship book. The Stokes situation broke open 3 weeks into November. A young mill worker named Seth came to the house on a Monday with a legal notice he had found on his mother's fence post. A filing from Aldgate and Associates in Hartford, claiming a defect in the 1831 survey for 5 properties on the eastern boundary. The notice cited the records gap from the courthouse fire. It claimed the titles were legally unresolved. Seth stood in the kitchen doorway and held the notice out with the careful expression of a man who is not sure the messenger will be thanked. Sebastian read it twice. He thought about Caroline's file. He wrote to her that afternoon. Her reply came in 2 days. It was 3 paragraphs, and it read the way all her serious correspondence read, clear, unhurried, without condescension. The first paragraph described the legal mechanism. The second noted that the 1831 survey had in fact been re-registered, not with the county but with the state land office in Hartford, a fact that Aldgate's filing had either failed to find or chosen to omit. The third paragraph said, "I have written to Mr. Coate. The documentation is already in the Eastern Boundary file. He can be before the county magistrate within a month. Tell Seth that his mother's title is sound." At the bottom, in a smaller hand, "I am willing to attend the magistrate's proceeding if the court requires a witness familiar with the survey correspondence. Tell me when." Sebastian set the letter down. He did not sit with it for long. Something had been shifting in him for weeks, slowly and then decisively. The way a large stone shifts when the ground beneath it has been gradually softening without anyone noticing. He rode to Josiah Brent's fence where he knew Crawford Stokes would be that afternoon, and he sat on his horse and said, in a voice that carried clearly to the 4 men close enough to hear, "I know what you've been filing, Crawford. I know the survey exists, and I know your attorney found it. You will tell Aldgate to withdraw. If I hear one more word of this from one more person in this county, I will take it before the magistrate myself and let the record show what you chose to do with a records gap and 5 families' land." He did not wait for an answer. He rode home. The story of what Sebastian said at Josiah Brent's fence moved across Wethersfield faster than any story that year. By supper time it had gone from the hardware store to the milliner's and back again. By morning it had reached Hartford. Caroline heard it from Mrs. Halloway, who had heard it from a cousin in Wethersfield, who had sent a note. She sat with the information over her morning coffee. He had ridden there himself, had not sent a letter, had sat on his horse and said it plainly in front of witnesses. Mrs. Lowe, she thought. Mrs. Lowe would say it doesn't fix anything, and it doesn't. One afternoon, one confrontation. It is not 15 years, it is not 7, it is one afternoon. But she thought about it for a long time. She met him at the seminary on a Saturday in late November. Sebastian arrived first. He sat in the small parlor the administrator had made available, hat on his knee, in the careful posture of a man who has rehearsed things and abandoned them all. When Caroline came in from the hall, chalk on her sleeve, hair pinned simply, the particular directness in her step that he had always noticed and never fully understood, he stood. She sat across from him. She waited. He said, "I've been trying to find the right words since October. I keep coming back to the same problem, which is that I don't have a language for this. My father was a man who believed that providing was loving. He never looked for a difference. I believed it too. He turned his hat once in his hands. I built a marriage on that belief. And the belief was wrong. And I don't know how to tell you how sorry I am in a way that is adequate. Because I don't think there is an adequate way." She looked at him steadily. She said, "Tell me 3 things about Caroline Webb. Not Mrs. Fairchild. Not the woman who ran your accounts, Caroline." He went still. She watched him actually think, not scan for a correct answer but search. His hands went quiet on his hat. He said, "You arrange your books by what you need when you reach for them in the dark." He held her gaze. "I noticed it the first winter we were married, and I thought it was strange, and I never asked you about it. Last week I stood in your study and understood it for the first time. Comfort on the left, courage on the right." He paused. "You reach for different shelves at different hours. I've watched you do it for 7 years without knowing what I was watching." She was very still. He said, "You stop humming the moment you think someone is nearby. I have heard your voice, actually heard it, unguarded, 3 times in 7 years. The third time was last April. You were in the kitchen garden before sunrise and you didn't hear me come down the path. I stood there for 2 minutes and I didn't call out to you because I didn't want you to stop." Something in his face went level and honest. "That was wrong of me. I made myself a person you had to hide from. I didn't understand what I'd done until you were gone." A silence. Outside, the November wind pressed at the parlor windows. He said, "Third." He stopped. He started again. "Third is the hardest to say because it isn't an observation. It's a reckoning." He met her eyes. "You manage the mill accounts and the tenant disputes and the scholarship fund and the coat source not because it was your duty, not for me. You did it because you cannot walk past a thing being done badly when you have the capacity to do it well. That is not a household skill, Caroline. That is who you are. And I spent 7 years calling it paperwork." His voice did not waver. "I am not going to tell you I didn't do that. I did. I want you to know I see it now." The room was absolutely quiet. Down the hall a student was practicing scales on a pianoforte, slowly, with great care, one note placed after another. She said very quietly, "That's right." He said, "I know it is. That's what I've been living with." She looked at him for a long moment. What she looked for was not the performance of change, but the texture of it. The effortfulness, the slight awkwardness of a man actually working at something, rather than demonstrating that he intends to. She saw it. She said, "I loved you, Sebastian. I want you to know that. Not a version of you I hoped would eventually appear. Actually you, the steadiness, the reliability, the way you could be counted on to do what you said. I built something real on that." She paused. "What I did not understand was that a foundation alone is not a home, and I am not going back to a house where I am invisible in my own rooms." He held her gaze. He did not flinch. He did not reach for the careful withdrawal she had seen so many times. She said, "Tell me what comes next would look like, if there is a next." He said, "Your faculty position continues, permanently, on your terms, under your name. That is not a concession, it is simply correct." He paused. "Your own account at the Hartford Bank, separate from the estate, entirely yours. Your presence at the beginning of every decision about the property and the mill, not informed afterward. Present." He looked at her. "And I want to learn to ask you what you think, what you're afraid of, what you want for yourself when no one is looking. I don't know how to do that naturally yet. I am going to be clumsy at it." He held her gaze. "But I know what it costs not to try. I know that now." She sat with it. She sat with the full weight of it, not whether the words were right, but whether the man behind them was. She said, "I'm not coming back today." He nodded. "I need more time, not to punish you, because I need to be certain." She met his eyes. "But I am not closing the door. I want you to know I'm not closing it." Something moved in his face, not quite relief, not quite hope, but the quiet and steady presence of both. He said, "That's enough." And he meant it the way a man means something when he knows what he's been given is exactly what was right. She came home on a Thursday in January, in the kind of cold that settles over the Connecticut Valley, and does not intend to leave until March. She borrowed her aunt's wagon and drove herself. 8 miles from Glastonbury on roads gone hard with frost. With her teaching bag on the seat beside her, and the seminary's spring term schedule in her coat pocket. Because she had a class Monday morning and saw no reason to leave it behind. Sebastian came to the gate when he heard the wagon. He came without his coat, which meant he had come quickly, which meant he had been listening for her. She pulled the horse to a stop, and they looked at each other across the yard. She said, "Help me with the trunk." He came forward and took the heavy end, and they carried it inside together, which was practical, and also felt the way practical things sometimes feel, like the right way to begin. Mrs. Hobart was in the hall. She said, "Mrs. Fairchild, welcome home." She said it without theater, which was exactly right. Isaac was in the kitchen yard when Caroline went out to check on the south fence she'd been thinking about since October. He looked up from the post he was setting. He took off his hat. He said, "Good to have you back, Mrs. Fairchild," she said. "Good to be back, Isaac." "How's the drainage on the north slope?" he told her. They stood in the January cold and talked about it for 10 minutes, and it was, she thought, exactly the kind of conversation she had been missing. That evening they sat by the fire in the study. Her study, which Sebastian had left precisely as she'd arranged it, every book in its proper place, the courage books still on the right, and they talked. Not about the estate. Not about Stokes or the magistrate or the mill, or any of the accumulated business of 7 years. They talked about what she was reading. About what he had been thinking about through the autumn. About what Christmas had been like in his father's house, which turned out to be formal and a little cold, and in her father's house, which turned out to have been small and disorganized and warm in a way she had not thought of in years. At some point, she could not have said when, something shifted in the quality of the silence between them. It became the silence of two people who are present with each other, not managing the room, not filling it, not skirting the edges of something unsaid. Just in it, together. Sebastian looked at her across the fire and said, "Are you glad you came back this way?" She thought about it honestly. She said, "I'm glad I drove myself." She paused. "I'm glad I know what I know now. About what I'm capable of. About what I need." She looked at him. "And I'm glad you learned what you learned." He said, "I love you, Caroline." He said it quietly, without performance, in the voice of a man saying something he has carried for a long time. I didn't know how to find the words for it. I buried the feeling under everything I thought was more important. I know what it is now. I want you to know it. She looked at him across the fire that had warmed this room since before either of them was born. She thought about the courage books on the right-hand shelf. How many mornings she had reached for them, and how clearly she had known, each time, that she was reaching for them. She thought she might not need to reach quite so often from now on. She said, "I love you too." I've been carrying it without saying so, and that was its own kind of dishonesty. She paused. "What's changed is that I believe for the first time it might be enough. That we might be enough if you keep learning and I keep telling you what I need." She held his gaze. "I am not going to be small again, Sebastian. Not for this house, not for this county, not for anyone." He said, "I don't want that. I want to see how large you actually are." He paused. "I think I've barely started." Something in her chest opened and stayed open. Not the fragile hoping of a woman waiting to be seen, but the grounded steadiness of a woman who knows her own worth, and has chosen, from that knowing, to be here. That was the difference. That was everything. She said, "Then we start from here, from what we both know now, from the truth even when it's hard." He said, "Especially when it's hard." The fire burned low between them and the January cold, pressed at the windows of the Fairchild house, and the room was warm, and the silence that settled between them was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The kind that belongs to two people who have finally learned to be fully present with each other. Come spring, the Hartford Female Seminary listed Caroline Fairchild among its permanent faculty, 2 days a week, under her own name. The county magistrate dismissed Aldgate's filings on all 5 properties, citing the 1831 state survey that Mr. Coates presented in full. Crawford Stokes did not contest the ruling. The scholarship fund grew to 11 names before the end of the year, and 3 of those girls would eventually teach in Wethersfield schools that had not yet been built. And Sebastian Fairchild, who had once called his wife's life's work paperwork, and who was still, daily, learning what that cost, was seen one Tuesday afternoon in March reading aloud to Isaac from the Hartford Courant while they walked the south fence line. An article on women's property rights, by C. Webb. Isaac listened. Sebastian finished the piece, folded the paper, and put it in his coat pocket. He said, with the slightly wondering tone of a man who is still learning how large the world is, "She's been right about all of it. For a long time." Isaac said, "Yes, sir." Sebastian nodded. He walked the rest of the fence line in the quiet March sunshine, and he kept the paper close, and the season turned, and the elms came back into bud, and Caroline Fairchild was already at her desk at the seminary by the time the light reached her study window at home. The courage books still waiting on the right-hand shelf, exactly where she had left them, exactly where they would always be,